It looks like we're live.
Yep. All right. So,
Hey.
hey, welcome everyone to the live. Thanks for joining us. My name's Camilla and this is Emma Demar, who's a therapist along with me at Intrinsic Woman, and Rebecca Appleman, who's a dietitian and has a practice. And we're here tonight to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of eating disorders in quarantine and how people are being affected, and to kind of go from there. So I'm just curious if you guys have noticed, I've suddenly noticed a pretty significant uptick, both in my patients who are talking about eating disorders and in terms of the number of calls that I'm getting lately, both with people struggling themselves and also a lot of parents noticing that their kids are struggling. You guys been hearing anything?
Yeah, I've been noticing that too. And a huge uptick in symptoms and a lot of regression back into old habits, especially now when people are feeling so out of control and are looking for any means to feel in control of things. So I'm definitely experiencing that.
Yeah. Rebecca, what about
you?
I
see the same thing, actually, Emma. And I think, yeah, I was saying I see the same thing. And I think that, you know, for everybody, having this massive disruption in their day-to-day existence is troubling, and I think is reason for them to reflect on just how they're living their lives. But I think for people, specifically the patient population that we see who's struggling with eating disorders, a disruption of this order in their day-to-day existence, it shifts everything about the way that they know how to manage their self-care. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a minute-to-minute disruption in terms of just the basic sort of necessities of living. So every meal in and out, they're noticing, I think, dysregulations in their appetite on both ends of the spectrum. So I have patients who are feeling like just a real lack of appetite altogether, mm-hmm. And not feeling like they can sort of tap into those natural hunger cues, ones that didn't struggle with that before. And then, of course, we have patients who are noticing just this constant need for food-seeking behaviors, and the emotional stimulus is promoting overeating. So I'm seeing just sort of this whole gamut.
Right. No, I agree with you. Rebecca, is there somewhere you can put the phone down? Because it's shaking, I think, a lot.
Is it? Oh, you know what? It's on my lap. Let me not do that. Hold on a second.
Somewhere you can put it.
Sorry, let me check. I have my computer on my lap.
While you're finding a place to
put better?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm seeing something really, really similar. And I also think it's worth saying that, you know, it's not abnormal during a period of stress for us to lose our appetites, right? Like that is a normal biological response to things. But what's also a normal biological response to things is as the stress level evens out, as we get a little more used to it, then our appetite tends to return. And I think for people who are already struggling with connecting with hunger cues, that's particularly challenging, both in terms of like, whoa, I don't want to feel hungry, and in terms of even recognizing that those cues have returned at all, right? Mm-hmm. So Emma, I'm curious, like in terms of what you're seeing with, you know, we talked a lot last night on our Instagram Live about control and like issues around control, and I'm wondering if you can speak more to that a little
bit. Yeah, I think that right now people are kind of grasping at straws and everything kind of feels very unknown. And I think, as we know, control is a large theme that we see with eating disorders. So I feel like that's why a lot of people are returning to symptoms as a way to also just to focus. I think that people don't know where to put their energies right now, and that gives them a very like narrow focus. If I control my food, then I will feel productive, for example. And so, and you know, also some people gain an appetite during stress as well. I actually was talking to a binge eater of mine who was saying that it's like an alcoholic being locked in a liquor store with no key. Right. And so like you're by your kitchen, you might be working out of your kitchen for all we know at this point. And so it's just recipe for disaster, right? Like you're right there with things. So it just runs the gamut. Like any single type of eating disorder that you're struggling with, you could be really affected right now.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. Rebecca, do you have like suggestions that you give people
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, clearly most recommendations are particular and specific to sort of each person based on, their situation. But in general, there are a few things that people need to remember and can benefit from. I mean, I think that your metabolic needs haven't shifted, most likely because of this pandemic, right? So your body still needs to be well fueled and nourished consistently throughout the day, whether or not you notice those hunger cues. So as you were saying, sometimes it could be a normal physiological response to not feel as hungry when you are anxious or when you're stressed or having any type of intense feeling. Some people somaticize that way, but it doesn't mean your body doesn't need fuel. And so it's like in these instances, we really need to encourage our patients to remember that their body requires nourishment and it deserves nourishment consistently throughout the day, whether or not they can detect that they're hungry. Mm-hmm. So just giving, even if it needs to start out small, a small introduction of something 3 times a day, right? And making sure that they're also hydrating, basics, like really basics, but just remembering them is important because it's a demonstration of respect for your body. People with eating disorders in general have a very difficult time treating their bodies with respect. And so despite feeling stressed and not feeling as hungry, they have to make sure they make it a priority to have something to eat.
Well, do you think that like everybody is struggling right now, eating disorder or no, with treating their bodies with respect? Like how are you seeing that manifest, either of you guys, with your non-eating disorder patients? Like what do you think's coming next?
Yeah, like self-care, hygiene for people struggling with depression right now, or just in general, not wanting to get out of bed and take care of themselves, and that they can do that right now. Like we were talking about last night, Camilla, that, they're allowed to sit in it. They're allowed to indulge in these ways of coping because they don't have maybe a schedule. They're not forced to be social, so they can regress right now. So I think, yeah, it affects everybody in different ways depending on what their vulnerabilities are.
Right. I agree.
Camilla, unfortunately, you cut out, my connection froze for a second. I just wanted you to clarify one point of your question. Can you just repeat it?
Yeah, I was just asking about sort of non-eating disorder patients, or just generally kind of self-care and ways of maintaining that and thinking about that, and whether people who don't generally have food-related concerns, or don't maybe have an eating disorder specifically, but might have food-related concerns, if you're noticing a pattern with them also struggling with self-care.
It's a really good question. Listen, even from a personal place, I think that I think every human being in these moments are pushed to consider, right? What their self-care routine looks like. I know I am.
Yeah.
I think that it is just, there is just nothing about this experience that is, I think, easy to digest, let's put it that way, right? And in more ways than one. One of the things I think is really interesting, you guys spoke about it last night in your really interesting discussion, and Camilla, you were referencing this sort of this compare and despair notion. I think that comes up a lot in AA, yeah?
Yeah.
And it's this sort of idea that, like, why should we assume that our experience should be like anybody else's? Right? So I think what's so interesting is, like, the one sort of peculiar piece about this whole experience is that we are all legitimately experiencing this at the same time, right? But it's causing different reflections and different behaviors as a result. Mm-hmm. And what I'm seeing a lot with my eating disorder patients specifically is that there is a massive increase in their comparisons to other people's bodies, mm-hmm. weight, shape, size, of not in real life, but in the images that they're looking at on Instagram or wherever all day. There is almost no break from it for some of our patients.
Right.
And I've found that to be a big topic.
So
in my sessions.
My spouse talks about this with respect to the idea of art, but there's this concept of the simulacrum, which is kind of like the idea that of a Norman Rockwell drawing, where, like, you see this perfect family with the Thanksgiving turkey and everybody's happy and it's 1950s and they're all smiling at each other. But, and that's the moment you see in any photograph too, but what you don't see is the fact that right after the picture is taken or drawn, that family's screaming at each other about, kind of all the dysfunction is emerging, right? And like, that's the problem with media too, is that like fundamentally it's a simulacrum. Like, I don't generally, unless it's really like funny, and even then it's kind of cruel, I don't post pictures of my kids freaking out, right? Like I post pictures of my kids looking cute and sweet, and the fact that Oliver learned to ride a two-wheel bike, not the fact that it took an hour and a half, and us falling on top of each other. Like none of that is the stuff that I post. So the problem when we think about the comparison, right, is like you're also comparing to the 1 or 2 or 4 images that one person picked to put up, right? They're not putting themselves up with their bad morning breath and their hair going crazy, and they're putting up a picture of what they think looks good, and we believe it's true.
Right.
There are even apps where you can airbrush yourself and change the size of your body on things. I've seen them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's called Facetune. It's a highlight reel for sure. I completely agree with that. And it's so dangerous for that reason. And especially with our, our younger patients that are consumers and they're on social media, it's extremely triggering. And a lot, we've talked about the exercise right now and the pressure around that, which obviously for eating disorders, that's, sometimes a large part of that. So, the idea, Rebecca, like you said, that what you need to do, your needs are going to look different than every other person. And it can be really hard to focus in on what those needs are when you're constantly bombarded with all these images. So that it's so important to take that step back and know, like, all right, that might work for this person or not, but that doesn't mean that that's what I need to be doing for me. And maybe I'm not supposed to exercise at all right now. Maybe my doctor has told me that, like that's so important to remember.
So that's a really smart point. And Camilla, it also builds on what you were saying, which is that hold on a minute. All these notices are popping up on my computer. Hold on, guys. I'm back. Okay. For those of you who know me, that shouldn't surprise you that happened. So one of the things that I'm seeing alongside this intense comparison with body shape, weight, size is also the comparison with food and what we're eating. What are people posting that they're eating? And, my whole food platform really rests on the fact that food does not have to be pretty, but anything that anyone is posting about what they're eating is like, is colorful and it's mixed and, in terms of textures, and it looks elaborate, and like, oh my God, who is doing? Anyone who has anything other to do than take care of just themselves personally is not eating like that. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just not possible. And one other layer is that I see a lot of like these motivational posts, like, now's a great time. Let's get in shape. Let's become leaner. Let's become more toned. Let's do all of that stuff. And I'm thinking, why? Like, why is that? How does that make any sense? But people are really susceptible to it. And I think especially people with eating disorders are susceptible to it because they already feel like there's something about their bodies that needs to be fixed. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to remind and they don't need fixing, but they do need to be paid. They need to be tended to, right?
Right. Well, and I think a really important piece of that is the idea that, like, we're talking about eating disorders, we're talking about the symptoms and how they manifest, but the truth is the eating disorder is never the primary problem, right? Like, the eating disorder develops in response to some other problem, whether it's depression, anxiety, history of trauma, lack of self-worth, like lots of different things. The eating disorder becomes a very real problem in and of itself, but it starts out in an attempt to be a solution for an underlying problem. It's a solution that's terribly, terribly wrong and ends up hurting more than it helps in every possible manifestation that it has. But it starts out as this attempt. And so like, you're talking about this, like, get lean, get fit. And it's like, okay, give me a break, right?
Right.
We are all so stressed out. We are dealing so much with feelings of fear and loss, because, and Emma, you've heard me say this about 5,000 times, but anxiety really only comes from one of three places, right? Fight, flight, or freeze, which is like you're running from a lion on the plains and like all of a sudden you're afraid you're going to be eaten. You either fight, you flee, or you get totally frozen. Thoughts we scare ourselves with, which are like 95% of anxious kind of experience, or things we're telling ourselves, negative predictions we're making. And then,
Right.
Being on the brink of the unknown. And we're all in this experience right now of being on the brink of the unknown. And it's hard
Right.
for every single one of us. We don't know what to expect. We don't know whether, when this is going to end, what it's going to look like for those of us in New York, what our city is going to look like. We just don't know what the economy is going to look like, what people's jobs are going to look like, any of that. So we're all contending with this incredible sense of uncertainty. And along with that comes this really profound feeling of loss, which is that all the ways in which we have marked time, in which we have marked expectation, in which we have kind of planned our lives and our days and our vacations, all of these things have kind of been wiped away in one fell swoop. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's enormous, and all of the ways we connect to people, apart from the tiny little social circle that most of us are in of our families, we're not having much wider interaction in terms of interpersonal connection, which takes a huge toll too. So at a time when we are incredibly stressed, we are incredibly anxious, we are contending with loss and the unknown, it is really tempting to avoid all those feelings. Right. And
it's like, how are you processing that grief?
Right. And so for a lot of people, eating disorders, or even just the idea of now's a great time to get fit. Well, if you're really trying to avoid everything that's going on and you're not really connecting with the reality of what your experience is, now's a really good time to get fit.
That's exactly right. That's exactly it. I think that's beautifully articulated. I think it is a thing, especially in the struggling with an uptick in behaviors that maybe were sort of somewhat remedied. I think that avoiding all of that, the intense grief and the anxiety, and throwing that energy into a new get fit routine or a new eating routine.
We keep
think about, again, that two primary questions I tend to ask my patients a lot, which is, what is the intention behind this behavior, right? Like what is the why are you using this behavior, right?
Rebecca, we keep losing you. Emma, do you want to ask some more questions since what
was I going to say? We talked about the control. I think, well, so with the whole, like, thinking about the bigger picture, right? Like, why are you recovering, and that doesn't change because we are in this state, right? Like, that your motivations shouldn't just like go away because of this situation. And somebody actually asked me, one of my patients, about something about intuitive eating, and they're like, how does that look now? And I'm like, well, it's the same thing. I mean, intuitive eating, it's all about tuning inward into your natural hunger and fullness cues and attending to those. So it's the same. It doesn't, none of that changes, and your recovery doesn't change because we are in this situation, except for the fact that you now get more time to really work on it, where you don't have all the stressors that you have normally, and you don't have the triggers of going out to a restaurant or things like that.
I mean, in some ways, though, like, the triggers you have are all in your own head, which might even be harder.
There's different triggers for sure.
And Rebecca, I think you could probably speak to this, but also, like, part of intuitive eating is also understanding that there are times where we need to recognize, it's, you know, been 6 hours since I last ate. I don't feel hungry, but like I know my body needs to be nourished on some level. Like,
That's exactly right.
that part of intuitive eating is an acknowledgement that there are times where like hunger may not cue us, right? Or that there are appropriate times, like when you go to a kid's birthday party, to have a slice of cake, whether or not you're hungry that day. And so I mean,
that's right.
Rebecca, you can speak to this probably better than I can, but like it's also important to understand that a big piece of intuitive eating is flexibility.
I think that's perfectly stated. I mean, I think it loops back to what we were talking about in the beginning of our conversation, which is that for people who sort of somaticize stress with a decrease in appetite, need that somebody who is truly an intuitive eater will know exactly what you're mentioning, which is that, oh my goodness, if it's breakfast, I eat breakfast at 9 o'clock and all of a sudden I turn around and it's 2 or 3 and I don't realize I'm hungry at all. It does not mean our body doesn't need food. And so we need to sort of, the intuitive eater will nourish despite the lack of a strong hunger cue, right?
Right.
The example you brought up with cake is a good one, birthday cake. It's actually always one of the examples I use when I talk about, you know, eating flexibly and eating just for the joy of how good the food tastes, right? I mean, no one ever eats birthday cake because they're hungry. That's like not the point of the cake, right?
Yeah.
The point of the right? Point of the cake is like, it's fun to look at. It's pretty. We get, you know, there's this whole fantasy about making a wish. Everyone sings, whatever, a million things that are fun about it. And you eat it because it tastes good. But you certainly should not be eating that because you're hungry. Mm-hmm. And in fact, any really dessert food is not the best choice for when we're truly hungry, because it's impossible to feel full from eating it. So those sort of foods that we want to include as we wish, but only because we want them, not because we're relying on them to actually meet a need, right?
Well, so, I mean, that's an interesting idea, right? Because how do you reconcile that with like the Janine Roth kind of eat whatever you want when you're hungry, as long as you stop when you're full, in order to kind of habituate? Like,
right.
Fusion Academy sent these, it took me a while to figure out where they came from, who had sent them, but they were Milk Bar, these cookies and these like birthday cake truffles that were absolutely divine.
They were in the office.
They sound amazing.
Right. And they were in the office, and like the first day we got them, I was like, oh, I want to try one. So I had one, and then I had 3 more because they were really, really good. Right. And the next day I was like, oh, they were really good. I want them. But this time I only wanted 2. And then the next day there were still 6 left, but like I didn't actually want any more because I was kind of done. Right. And like that's sort of the principle of the situation, right? The idea that like super exciting food was a lot less exciting 3 days in, because it wasn't a thing where I was like, no, I can't have it, must resist. It was just, sure, it's there, have it, enjoy it, great. So how do you reconcile, because Janine Roth talks about the idea of like introducing, you know, M&Ms or cookies, like kind of, and I think the idea is habituation, right? But like what you're saying is also true, that like you need kind of other types of food to truly feel full. So how do you?
Right. I think, well, first of all, Janine Roth is brilliant. Mm-hmm. And I think that she has helped so many people heal. So, and I think that everything about her methods and her philosophy with food makes sense. I guess what I see though in my practice is that it is so hard for people who are struggling with food at baseline. Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's hard. It is not, I mean, just scientifically it's true. It's harder to detect fullness with a sweet fat combination food, right? Mm-hmm. It's much easier to eat like more cake than it is chicken, just by nature of how they're, right? Just by nature of what they are composed of. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean chicken's good and cake is bad. So, you know, I think that just the recommendation that I had made about like really looking toward those sort of dessert type foods as ones that you should enjoy with pleasure as you wish, and be totally inclusive of them. I think that where I caution my patients to sort of, I caution them, and caution's the wrong word, but just for purposes of this conversation, go with me. I do feel that it's a helpful strategy to encourage sweet fat combination foods following a meal that will help them recognize their satiety with more success. I think it gives them, I think, a way to become an intuitive eater that is less scary. Do you know what I mean? It's taking a little less risk. But I mean, and there are certain patients that are just, I mean, Camilla, we've shared some of them that are just, they are so activated. There are certain foods that are so activated for them, they can't go near them yet. Like, you need to sort of phase them in, So I really think that the answer is very client specific. But in general, I think that, listen, like, there is no responsible way to eat that in my opinion, that is not an all foods fit paradigm, right? There can be nothing that's off limits.
Right. No, I totally agree. Although I do have to say that the amount of habituation to banana bread that's going to have happened by the end of the quarantine. I mean, I've heard people are baking so much that there are flour shortages.
I believe it.
Yeah.
I can't believe how many pancakes I've made over the course of this thing so far. It's ridiculous. Like, I think we've had that flour in my house for years, and now we've been buying like crazy.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, Emma, what were some of the other topics we had talked about that we wanted to make sure we got to tonight?
Well, I wanted to bring up like boundaries with who you're quarantining with, or just the fact that, well, obviously we know eating disorders thrive in isolation. There are some people that are isolated right now with their eating disorders. And there's also people that are living with family, and there's family meals, there's so many different triggers with that. So how to navigate those relationships and the importance of, setting boundaries and maybe teaching other people, okay, here's, what's helpful to say to me, here's what's not, that kind of stuff.
Right. It's a lot of family time. Right. And
yeah.
I mean, Rebecca, I feel like you're probably seeing this most clearly in terms of what you're hearing people say.
Well, I mean, I think we're all probably, I think this is a brilliant topic, but I think we could spend 4 hours talking about it, because I think that like depending on where people are sheltering, right? Whether it's totally alone. So I have patients like you, Emma, who live alone, who are single and who live alone in New York City. And it is painful.
Yeah.
Very hard for them.
Yeah.
Very hard. It feel like, like meal in and meal out, be on your own, it is really, really tough. And then I have some of my college kids who went back to their families of origin. And, if that system was a primary trigger for the development of their eating disorder, which in many cases it has contributed, we are just noticing, it's just a renewed struggle. It's like they had sort of, I feel like for our patients who we've been working with for a while and they'd gotten into a groove, they had separated from a lot of those triggers, and then they're sort of now right back in them. I'm finding that, like, look, with certain people, they're really doing a strong job. And with others, they need more support.
Well, and I think so much is about communication. Emma, you were hitting on this, right? The idea that like a big piece of having an eating disorder is struggling to have a voice. So instead of articulating what's going on, there's a tendency to represent it physically, whether it's by stuffing down the feeling or the thing that wants to be said, whether it's by purging it, whether it's by refusing to acknowledge any need at all, by refusing to eat. Any of these things are alternative ways of self-expression. The problem is they're really unclear. And the specifics of what you need at any given moment is unclear. And so a big piece of the work with eating disorders, or anyone struggling, frankly, ever, especially women, but men too, is learning to say, hey, I know you mean well.
Yeah.
But when you say, are you sure you want to eat that? I want to bash you over the head with my donut. Or do you think that's enough food? Yeah, I think it's enough food. Thanks. That's not helpful right now. you know, if you want to, after a meal, take me aside and say, I'm a little concerned that you're not adequately taking care of yourself and you're struggling. Is there something I can do to be useful or helpful to you? That's a very different story.
Right. And just also people, you know, look, when I meet with families who have a child of any age who's struggling, one of the first ground rules that we set is that there is no safe way to comment about people's weight, shape, and size,
right?
Or what they're eating for that matter. Like, there is no safe way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And frequently the question I'll get next is like, yeah, but what if I'm just telling them they look amazing? Like, yes, still not safe. Do you know what I mean? That's not a safe comment.
Mm-hmm.
It is just too loaded. And also, what difference does it make, right? You know, so I think that, you know, there might be generational, you know, sort of reasons, you know, people who are, you know, with, you know, quarantining with parents or grandparents who are, you know, who are older, their systems and their constructs for how they spoke about these things were just different, right? And I'm not excusing it, but it's so routinized for them to have conversation like this,
Mm-hmm.
and they might not have the awareness to make those shifts. And whereas maybe there was a buffer before, it's flat in their face now. So I think, Camilla, you're right. Like, by communicating that boundary is so important. Whether or not they respect it is the other issue. And then what happens when that boundary is not respected?
Right. Well, I mean, and I think that's a twofold dilemma, right? Because it's not just whether they respect the boundary, it's whether you respect that person's difference in how you choose to communicate your boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're gonna have a lot more success getting grandma and grandpa to listen, and it's not a guarantee, but by saying, hey, grandma, like, I know you mean well, and at the same time, that's probably, when you say it like that, here's what I'm hearing, and I know that's not what you intend, so you think you could maybe shift that a little bit. And again, I could definitely see a grandmother being like, I forgot, you know. I'm so sorry, right? And that's a piece of also accepting their limitations.
Right.
I mean, Emma, I'm curious, what you were the one who kind of came up with that thought or that question, which was such a good one, about like setting boundaries and communication and stuff. Are there specific things that you feel like you wanted to add in here?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that idea of kind of teaching, I think that is, like you said, it's part of recovery, really, is like learning how to stand up for yourself, but also like knowing what works for you and what kind of language works for you and what doesn't. And so I feel like this is the time that you can really, I mean, it's a difficult time because if you are being forced to be with your family of origin right now, and that's a really triggering thing, that can be tough, but it's the time to fine tune those things and to, you know, maybe work through those differences in opinion and relationships that can be triggering. So it's a lot of that. And the people in isolation, it's about figuring out ways to connect, because eating is a large thing that's like a social thing that we do. And to have to, like you said, be in an apartment by yourself in the city and you're single, having a meal by yourself every time, like, really can feel depressing. And so is there a way to make it like a virtual meal with somebody? And there's obviously support groups and things like that people can join. And I always encourage my patients to do that, especially if they are isolated right now.
And there's also there's a logistical and like a practical struggle right now with people who are what I think, sort of going with this sort of theme of like, if you're, you know, single and you're on your own and you're quarantining on your own, but I think it affects even more than that. I mean, I can sort of reflect on it a little bit in my family structure. I'm a family of 5, and we're dealing with this like logistical issue too. I mean, with food procurement, right? It takes a lot of energy now and a lot of planning to like get groceries and then deal once you've gotten the groceries, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on like what your degree of sensitivity is to the sanitizing process, right? But it's a big effort. So when you're purchasing, very likely you're kind of like getting a lot, right? So people are finding that their fridges and freezers and their pantries are like stocked overflowing, all the way to the point to like, oh my God, Bear, like I have 1 slice of cheese, ketchup, and like maybe I have a piece of bread. Like it's just, right? So what's a struggle, I think, just practically is how, like, I think it takes more planning to feed one individual and to feed 5 or 6 or 7 individuals in one quarantine situation. It just takes a lot more planning. And that in and of itself is stressful. I myself find it so annoying that I can't just run to the store to grab something, right? It's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's even harder for people who are just already struggling with the food equilibrium, right? And haven't established that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys seeing that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really fair. And, you know, I kind of was thinking as you guys were talking about this, like one of the really cool things that I'm seeing happen is that every eating disorder treatment facility or, you know, IOP or PHP, they've all gone pretty much national because they've all got these virtual supports. Anything from like free support groups, if you're thinking maybe you've got an eating disorder and like want to go somewhere to talk about it on Zoom, to, you know, people offering meal support, which like for people who don't know what that is, right, that's someone being there helping you, coaching you through the meal, whether it's coaching you through the prep and the eating itself, the eating, like whatever that is, but that can be incredibly supportive. To, you know, actual group therapy that is going on, and individual therapy, which is, you know, on some level what we're all doing, whether it's nutrition therapy or psychological therapy, going on in this virtual way. So like, I think it's really important to kind of, for people to be aware that like, you don't have to just sit there with your eating disorder and endure until this ends.
That is so smart to say.
Right.
That there are actually, and that the access, and right, and really what you're saying is the accessibility to resources resources are more accessible.
Well, the food, not so much, but the resources to support you in eating it, yeah.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, we all, the 3 of us, have moved our entire practices to virtual platforms and continue to support our patients and are working with new people as well. So you're right. I think that it is so important to send the message to people who are struggling that they are not alone. Right.
Well, and Emma, I think you and I are seeing this too, that like, not only are they not alone, but then on top of that, and I had mentioned this at the beginning, right, I have gotten so many calls and emails from parents who are noticing that their children are struggling.
Well, you can't escape too, right? Like the kids can't really hide what they're doing as much as they could before.
Totally. It's all underfoot. So where they might have been able to hide because maybe they were eating 1 meal at home a day and could maybe fake it through that meal, all of a sudden the 3 meals and snacks home a day, and suddenly a mom or a dad is going, wait,
right,
how come you haven't eaten and it's 6 o'clock at night? You know, or how come you keep going to the bathroom after you eat? Like what's going on here?
That's right.
And so parents are really noticing. I mean, I keep bringing this video up, and Rebecca, I sent this to you, The Great Realization, right? This really sweet, and for those of you who are watching who haven't seen it, please, you know, go to YouTube and type in The Great Realization because it's incredibly sweet. And it's his father talking about, you know, many years from now when he's talking to his son about this time period and what happened during this time period. And the virus is a pretty small part of the story. What is the significant part of the story is the idea that like we went from being together but all looking at screens, so not really being connected, to kind of finding each other again, and the importance of slowing down and really attending to each other. And I think that, you know, there aren't a ton of articles about it, but I'm definitely seeing more and more articles about families who sit down and eat together and are suddenly talking more and are, you know, interacting more. And I certainly feel like more of a partner with my spouse. I mean, there's no more like, what should we get for dinner? I don't know. I've been working all day. Like, I have no clue what we have in the house. You just deal with the order, right? Like the food order to, oh, should we add this to the Instacart order? Yeah, let's add this and let's add that. And did you add this before? And no, I didn't. Do you want to add it? Right? And that it's becoming, there's more attention. There's more partnership for some of us. But along with that means we're seeing our kids more. We're seeing their strengths and we're seeing their struggles. I think a lot more. And so it's an opportunity for parents to kind of go, oh wow.
Right.
We need to deal with this. And we don't need to wait till the end of quarantine. We need to deal with it now.
Right. And I wonder if we should it might be helpful for people to understand what some of the, like that is peculiar type of behaviors are.
Yes.
What to look out for.
I definitely.
Yeah. Maybe that would be helpful. I mean, just from a food, there are many, but like just from a food perspective, I think Camilla mentioned some of them, like, eating one meal a day is not normal. So if and it's not normal when there are, when whoever is restricting their intake in that way is saying, well, I had 10 Zooms and then I have to study for this test. And like, there is no explanation for not feeding yourself at least 3 appropriate balanced meals in a day. Okay. So like if parents are seeing that kids are skipping out here and there and making up excuses for it, that's not great.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cause for at least, conversation or for some sort of reflection on it, or to maybe dig a little deeper.
Mm-hmm.
They might also be seeing patterns. Camilla, you mentioned running to the bathroom often. Of course, that would be, an obvious cause for concern. Hiding food, sneaking food, urgencies with food. So like eating and then asking for more food before what they're eating is even done. Constantly seeking out food, right? Constantly, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, despite very appropriate meal eating. Right? I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry might be language for something else that they don't have the words to communicate. I think that for our adolescent boys and girls, I think just if, their lives revolve around some of these social media platforms, if not all of them. But I think that right now we need to be extra special careful, but like, what are they looking at? And if there's an exhaustive search for diet types of platforms or searches or, research on food and how to eat and what to eat, and will I get, questions about weight, all of that stuff is reason for a parent to certainly not panic, but just to sort of think about it and maybe talk to somebody about it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And there are also great resources available online too, like the Full Bloom Project, right? Like, which is body positive parenting. So like there may be some answers there for you in terms of like, oh crap, how do I respond to my kid about XYZ? Or like, gosh, my daughter or son seems to be really critiquing their physique. What are some things that I can do to kind of be balancing and sending different messages? Right. Intuitive Eating is a great book. Health at Every Size, also a great book, really destroys. I mean, this country is so filled with insane mythology about different diets and eating behaviors and stuff. I mean, the 3 of us have certainly talked about this extensively, and I think we all want to pull our hair out about just the kind of nonsense that is out there. That people really think is truth. Like, for example, there is not a single study linking sugar to inflammation, not a single scientific study that has been conducted that proves that sugar is linked to inflammation. Like, not one. It's just this like mythology that seems to have built up, and nationally, and seems to be accepted fact, right? Which is like fascinating. So really understanding that like there's a lot out there that we take for granted that isn't even accurate, and so seeking out the resources of individual practitioners, but also there's a lot of information available if you know where to look.
And even for parents, a lot of helpful books. Like without Ed, like there's just a lot of literature for parents as well. And also just to add to the things to look for, I would say anything with the scale, body checking, mirrors, things like that. I mean, when you are in close proximity with your kids right now or whomever, you can see those things up close. So those are things to look at for as well.
And also shifts in eating patterns. So if you had a child who always loved having dessert after dinner, and then all of a sudden is saying, no, I don't like that anymore. I don't want that anymore. Or I can't because I didn't, I can't because, or I shouldn't. Like the shoulds and the can'ts and that type of language is also sort of something to note.
The arbitrary rules, right? Like where did that come from? Yeah.
Exactly right.
So, we've been talking about this. We've covered a huge breadth of topics and information. And like what I would say also is people are more than welcome to reach out on our Facebook page and ask questions. We are in some way, shape, or form planning to hold some kind of virtual meeting pretty regularly. We'll be posting about it, whether on Instagram, on Facebook, or frankly, both probably with some frequency. So, if there are questions, if there are topics you want us to cover specific to eating disorders, or frankly anything else that's mental health related, or food related, like we're really happy to do that. Just let us know. And before we sign off, is there anything that you guys feel like we haven't covered that seems particularly important right now that you're really seeing crop up?
The only other thing would be more time with your body. And I think for people to try to run from that, and you're really sitting in it right now.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't distract too much. So people, some of my patients talking about showering and just like really just like sitting there and feeling uncomfortable, which is both good and bad, right? And I think it's a good practice in mindfulness to really sit in that and use it as work and an exercise for you in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a challenge, of course, as well. And just to be mindful that like there is more time and there aren't really that many ways to escape right now from those things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think this is a larger topic, but one other thing that that's coming up in some of my sessions is this idea that people feel safer actually taking some risks in their eating disorder recovery work because of the lack of social contact. So it's an interesting thing to explore. I think that because of their mythical thinking about how they previously anticipated eating X, Y, or Z would impact their weight, shape, size, they feel less pressure because they feel like, well, if there's a shift in my weight, shape, size, I'm sort of just home. And for whatever reason, that is motivating some risk taking. I'm not saying it's coming from the healthiest place, let's say, but I do think it's an interesting theme that I'm noticing sort of across the board. So we're like, I'm accessing it, like I'm using it, because I think that anytime that they're willing to challenge an eating disorder thought, it's good, Right.
As long as they understand that, like, once you challenged it, and if you've managed to kind of encounter it and deal with it in quarantine, then the next step is to extrapolate that to life, because one thing will go back, right?
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And
so nice to talk to you guys.
Talk soon.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.